Thanks for sending over your sources on French history. We've gone through your stack of summaries and notes, and it's quite a journey you've curated.
It really is.
Today, we're going to deep dive into this material together, taking us from, well, ancient Gaul all the way through France's modern challenges.
It really is a rich tapestry, isn't it? Your sources highlight key events, pivotal figures, and major cultural shifts that didn't just shape France, but, left an indelible mark on the world.
Exactly.
Our mission is to really extract the most important insights from these documents for you, the stuff that helps us understand what makes France, well, France.
Precisely. Think of this as unpacking the essentials from your sources. Let's jump right in at the deep ancient end.
Okay.
Your material starts way back in prehistoric France, something like 35,000 years ago, pointing to the painted caves in places like the Dordogne and Pyrenees.
Lascaux, Chauvet-Pontac.
Yeah. And looking at that ancient artwork, the sources describe it evoking not just wonder, but even a sense of, well, disturbance today.
And what's fascinating about these cave paintings, according to the notes you provided, is where they're found and what they depict.
Right, deep inside, not near the entrances.
Exactly, deep inside the dark recesses. And the focus is overwhelmingly on animals, bison, mammoths, wild horses drawn with incredible skill. There's a quote here. As the Neanderthal people faded away, their Homo sapiens successors proceeded to demonstrate their superior skills with startling representations of bison or mammoths or wild horses, which leave the urbanized viewer of today not only impressed, but troubled.
Troubled, interesting word.
Yeah, and the lack of human figures, the ambiguous symbols. It suggests that this wasn't just, art for decoration. It was something more significant, maybe hunting rituals, worship, harder to interpret, as the sources say. They quote, "It is clear that the paintings are not to be found towards the opening of the caves. This was therefore neither a casual pastime nor art as decoration, but something more significant and harder to interpret."
So moving forward a bit, the sources then contrast the Roman view of the Gauls, unstable barbarians, with the evidence of their surprising ingenuity.
Yeah, that's a stark contrast.
We're talking practice surgery, amazing metalwork, calendars. They're even credited with inventing things like soap and the wine barrel.
Yeah.
And the coat of mail.
Pretty practical inventions, the quote goes. Yet these barbarians were also ingenious people who practiced surgery, excelled at metalwork and jewelry, had solar and lunar calendars, and are credited with the invention of soap, the wine barrel, and the coat of mail.
But because the Gauls relied on oral tradition, getting a full picture of their true nature is, well, elusive for us now.
Right. So when the Romans arrived, driven by trade and military expansion, which led to the Gallic Wars, it wasn't just a simple conquest. It was a massive cultural upheaval. Establishing those Roman provinces laid down foundational layers, creating a dynamic that would see future conflicts between the existing local identities and the new powerful Roman authority.
Okay, so fast forwarding through the fall of Rome, the breakdown of order leads to the rise of feudalism. This system where local lords hold power based on land and loyalty, right?
Decentralized.
Exactly, a response to insecurity. And this is the world the Capetian dynasty emerged into with Hugues Capet.
And their early period, the sources note, was a real uphill battle, just trying to establish the idea of centralized royal power against these strong vassals and external threats.
But that struggle, difficult as it was, that was the seed for the future unified kingdom. The sources mention Hugues Capet did in fact have to fight various power battles during his reign, and he survived a plot against him in AD 993, though his position was too weak to enable him to punish the perpetrators.
So weak initially, but foundational.
Precisely. And if we zoom out, the big insight here from your sources is that by the end of the first millennium, the place we'd eventually call France was far from a unified nation. It was this complex mosaic of ancient legacies, Gallic identities, Roman structures, and these new feudal power shifts. A real melting pot already. Okay, let's shift into the Middle Ages. An era whose physical legacy is still so present, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Your sources point to the enduring influence you can see everywhere, from the magnificent cathedrals to fortified city centers like Chartres and Paris. The quote here is just, "The cathedral is the central defining feature." Even some academic titles today apparently have roots back then.
And what's interesting is how your sources contrast that romanticized image knights' chivalry with the harsher realities. The quote says, "Of course, the whole period has been bathed in the soft light of romance." But that spirituality in the cathedrals existed alongside immense brutality, disease, conflict, deep uncertainty. Not so romantic when you look closer.
So within that feudal structure, the kings had, well, limited authority. The early Capetians were constantly trying to assert control over their own domains, while these powerful vassals held huge territories, leading to civil strife.
And the church provided a crucial source of moral authority in this fragmented landscape. Your sources mention a war of succession within an overextended feudal system as typical of the period.
Okay, so that context makes the Crusades, starting in 1095, a really fascinating turning point.
Definitely. While driven by religious aims, the sources suggest they had this unintended consequence back home. They actually helped weaken the power of many nobles.
How so?
Well, many sold off land to fund their expeditions, or they simply died abroad. This, in turn, inadvertently helped the rise of a commercial class people outside the feudal system.
Ah, right.
And this new class often found their interests better served by a stronger, more centralized monarchy rather than fractured local lords.
Right, so the kings started to gain ground. Louis VI worked to consolidate power, gave charters to growing towns, suppressed bandits.
Yeah, started bringing some order, and Louis VII continued this, gradually strengthening royal authority despite facing his own challenges.
But the reign of Philippe Auguste, that seems like a significant leap according to your notes.
Absolutely. He dramatically expanded French territory, really consolidated royal power, and established France as a leading player in Europe. Your sources highlight improvements in administration, daily life during his time, though conflict with the church and rivals definitely persisted.
Then we get Louis IX, St. Louis. He's presented in the sources as this model of medieval kingship, right? Balancing deep piety with effective governance.
Yes, a key figure. He made moves towards greater independence from the Vatican, laying more groundwork for a centralized state. He left a significant legacy, even though his crusades didn't achieve their military goals. The sources note, yet it also superbly fulfilled its religious purpose. And this push towards centralization really accelerated under Philippe IV. He expanded the monarchy's power even further, streamlined governance, and notably picked a major fight with the church.
Against the Knights Templar.
Exactly, moving against the wealthy Knights Templar. This conflict really underscored that growing divide between the power of the crown and the power of the church.
So by the late 13th century, your sources describe a period of significant economic and cultural development.
Yeah, things were looking up in a way. Economic growth led to an expanding middle class, cities became vibrant trade hubs, and culture and education flourished, often, interestingly, still supported by the church.
And those Gothic cathedrals we mentioned earlier.
The sources emphasized they were more than just places of worship. They were powerful symbols of spiritual aspiration, central hubs for city life, and concrete representations of the era's economic vitality and religious fervor. Huge public works, really.
But then the 14th century brought immense crisis. The Great Famine, and then, devastatingly, the Black Death.
Catastrophic. Swept through, profoundly disrupting society, weakening the church, weakening the feudal system.
And these calamities fueled civil unrest, intensified power struggles, all against the backdrop of the 100 Years' War.
A truly tumultuous time. And out of that period emerges Joan of Arc, a really pivotal figure.
How do the sources portray her?
As embodying that desperate struggle for French sovereignty against English occupation. Her actions symbolize a nascent sense of national identity, of unity. The sources ask, what was the source of Joan's extreme strength of conviction?
A good question.
And they argue her unwavering belief was critical. She understood the political necessity of consolidating support around the Dauphin, Charles. Quote, "It was this that enabled her to grasp so clearly the essential political imperative that Charles could only impose himself."
So by the end of the Middle Ages, led by figures like Charles VII and his successors consolidating power, the sources show France moving decisively towards a more centralized monarchy.
That's the key takeaway. This new status was formalized by Charles VII, and so by the end of the 15th century, France was really transforming, setting the stage for the modern state. So when you look back at this whole medieval period through the lens of your sources, you see this profound shift, right? From a fragmented feudal landscape towards a central monarchy. That movement from just regional identities towards a budding sense of nationhood. It still resonates in French identity today. You can feel it in the culture, see it in the architecture.
All right, let's dive into the 16th century then. Your sources call this a pivotal transition to modernity. An era where the medieval world started to, well, crumble under the weight of new discoveries, new innovations.
Exactly. There's a quote here from the poet Joachim de Bellay around the 1550s. France, mother of the arts, of arms and of laws, singing the praises of this new Renaissance France.
A sense of rebirth.
And a massive driver of this shift, mentioned prominently in your notes, was the rise of printing, starting in the 1470s.
Huge impact.
Huge. It dramatically reduced the control the church and monarchy had over information. Ideas could spread faster, wider, enabling critiques of authority, like Martin Luther's, to gain traction in ways that were just impossible before.
And this period also saw the clearer formation of distinct nation-states across Europe, Spain, England, France, really solidifying their unique identities.
Though the political landscape remained complex. Territorial ambitions, dynastic conflicts. Francois I, for instance, was heavily involved in military campaigns in Italy, which, as your notes mention, often didn't end well for him.
While other powers like Spain and Portugal were building these vast overseas empires, France's focus, at least initially, seemed more on those military ventures closer to home in Italy.
Right. But culturally, it was a time of revival, partly fueled by periods of domestic peace. Francois was a major patron. He imported Italian art, architectural styles.
Bringing the Renaissance to France.
Exactly. The sources describe how the impact of the Italian Renaissance fundamentally transformed French cultural life. Significant artistic achievement under royal patronage.
But underneath this cultural flowering, religious tensions were escalating dramatically.
Oh, yes. The rise of Protestantism challenged the authority of the Catholic Church head-on, increasing friction, the emergence of the Huguenots, France's Protestant minority.
And this tension boiled over into the devastating wars of religion.
Basically a brutal civil war, driven by religious conflict. The sources note Catherine de Medicis tried moderate approaches, but they failed to stop the violence. Profound instability.
It's during this time we get Henri I's famous quote, right? When he converted to Catholicism.
Yes, the pragmatic, Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass, securing the throne. Your sources also offer that quote from Montaigne reflecting on judgment. We simply call barbarous those customs that are different from our own. It seems indeed that in our search for truth and reason, we cannot see beyond the ideas and conventions of our own country. A really powerful thought for such a divided time.
Definitely. So the 16th century, this explosive mix, cultural brilliance from the Renaissance colliding with brutal religious strife and relentless political maneuvering.
A defining period, which leads us to the 17th century, often called the Grand Century in France, dominated by Louis XIV, the Sun King.
Gloire et grandeur.
Glory and greatness, exactly. Quote, for the French, the 17th century comes under the sign of gloire et grandeur, glory and greatness. And Versailles. His palace wasn't just a home, it became the ultimate symbol of power centralized entirely around an absolute monarch.
But your sources give crucial context leading up to this. France had been rocked by turmoil, the end of the wars of religion, Henri I's assassination, weak periods under Louis XIII, early Louis XIV, those major internal rebellions, the Fronde.
A lot of instability. Yet, remarkably, France still grew wealthier, more populous. It set the stage for the dominance under Louis XIV.
And Henri IV, before his assassination plunged things back into uncertainty, he's noted for being pragmatic, wasn't he?
Very much so. The sources highlight his focus on practical governance, promoting peace, economic growth, agriculture, manufacturing, stabilizing finances with ministers like the Duc de Sully. There's that quote. Henri V's no-nonsense manner, his novel concern that every laborer should be able to have a chicken in the pot on a Sunday, his belief in peace and religious tolerance, and doubtless also his amorous adventures, led him to be seen as le bon roi Henri.
Le bon roi Henri.
And the sources note that figures like him and Sully paved the way. Quote, Louis IV's path to power would be smoothed by a series of strong and competent figures, beginning with Henri I himself and his minister Sully.
Then Louis XIV relied heavily on Cardinal Richelieu.
Yes, Richelieu was instrumental, strengthening the monarchy's authority, suppressing internal opposition, and crucially, shifting France onto the European stage by engaging in the 30 Years' War. A real turning point in foreign policy.
So when Louis XIV takes personal control in 1661, he embodies this idea of absolutism.
Completely. His reign was a deliberate project to emphasize state power, cultural supremacy. France became the center of European prestige, and that elaborate, highly ritualized court life at Versailles That was a tool.
How so?
A deliberate tool to reinforce the king's supreme position. It drew the nobility away from their regional power bases, consolidated all influence right there at court under his eye. Quote, in short, he had established the general framework for the glory days of the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV.
And his own view of his role, authority from God.
The sources confirm that, yes. Quote, at the fundamental level, he did indeed believe that the king derived his authority directly from God. But surprisingly, his private writings, his memoirs, show a more, well-grounded pragmatism.
Really?
Yeah, quote. So it may be a little surprising to find him in his memoirs the more reliable, and that they were never intended for publication, showing himself to be sober and shrewd within the limits of the value system of the time, and telling his son that the job of the king is basically to see that common sense prevails.
Common sense prevails.
Yes.
From the Sun King.
Interesting. Isn't it? And this was also a period of incredible cultural achievement under his patronage. French classicism flourished. Descartes, Pascal, Molière, Racine. Absolutely. Their works reflected the social dynamics, yes, but also reinforced the values and grandeur of the monarchy. Quote, this was a time of French cultural ascendancy in Europe. This was where wit, refined manners, and high fashion were to be found.
But his huge military ambitions, they constantly strained the royal finances, didn't they? Even with Colbert trying to boost the economy through mercantilism.
Yes, the escalating wars eventually contributed to underlying instability. Big cost.
And crucially, later in his reign, his actions, particularly revoking the Edict of Nantes in 1685, that alienated a lot of people.
A major turning point. It drove out many skilled Protestant Huguenots, which weakened the economy and created this simmering layer of dissatisfaction that would, grow over time.
Which brings us neatly to the 18th century. Your sources describe it as a paradox. On one hand, immense cultural wealth, intellectual ferment the Enlightenment. On the other, deep financial and social problems bubbling under the surface of that absolute monarchy.
Exactly. Louis XIV's final years, before his death in 1715, were marked by military setbacks, War of Spanish Succession, domestic tensions, heavy financial strains, leading to significant unrest.
The regency that followed, under the Duc d'Orléans, saw a bit of a relaxation of that strict absolutism.
It did. But this period also brought its own issues. More power was conceded back to the aristocracy through the Parlement de Paris, which created new challenges, contributed to economic instability.
And the economic crisis really deepened. The debt from Louis XIV's wars was crippling.
Absolutely. And John Law's ambitious attempt at financial reform, well, it led to a speculative bubble and a dramatic crash, severely eroding public trust in the monarchy's financial management.
So Louis V's long reign, 1715 to 1774, it saw periods of prosperity, population growth, industrial advances.
It did, yes. But your sources point to his lack of decisive leadership, his reliance on advisors and mistresses, as signs of fundamental weaknesses at the heart of the monarchy.
And amidst this uneven rule, cultural and political movements thrived, often outside or opposing the official court.
Exactly. Writers, philosophers championed reason, civil liberties, openly critiqued the system, setting the intellectual stage for fundamental change.
This intellectual ferment is the Enlightenment, right?
Precisely. Ideas about society, governance, human rights spreading rapidly through literature, salons, figures like Voltaire, Rousseau debating tolerance, inequality, the social contract.
Your sources quote Rousseau, "Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains."
A powerful line. And they also include one highlighting a changing focus. Happiness is a new idea in Europe, a shift in perspective.
And against this backdrop, tensions between the monarchy and the parliament, especially over taxes and royal authority, they escalated.
Steadily, public sentiment turned against the crown. It was increasingly seen as out of touch, ineffective.
So the path to revolution became, well, unavoidable, culminating in 1789.
Your sources describe this perfect storm. Economic crises worsened by bad harvests, years of financial mismanagement, political missteps by Louis VI, and his failure really to grasp the depth of the demands for change.
His resistance to reform led directly to the storming of the Bastille, that symbolic uprising.
Right. The sources quote Louis VI's own view, "I alone shall be responsible for the happiness of my peoples," a view completely disconnected from reality by then. They also offer that comparison. It was weakness that put Charles I's head on the block.
A chilling parallel.
So the stage was set. The magnificent display of absolute power under Louis XIV, while creating gloire et grandeur, also sowed seeds of discontent through its centralization and financial strain. Then came the Enlightenment, providing the intellectual tools to challenge that absolute authority. This collision entrenched power, new ideas, mounting hardship, created the explosive conditions that led to the end of the monarchy. Your sources frame the idea of the French exception historically in this period. Quote, "The long-standing idea, the French exception, a special national destiny and a commitment to grandeur, is based historically on the combination of two ideas which are spectacularly enshrined in the monarchical society of the Grand Siècle."
A powerful illustration of how seemingly stable systems can unravel.
Absolutely.
Okay, jumping into the French Revolution itself. Your sources highlight how historians still disagree intensely about its fundamental nature. Was it mainly socioeconomic class struggle, or driven more by political ideology, the fight for rights?
Vigorous disagreements, as the quote says. So it is hardly surprising to find vigorous disagreements among historians about the nature and the significance of the revolution. Regardless of interpretation, its massive influence is undeniable on later global events, like the Bolshevik Revolution.
Its echoes haven't died away, as another quote puts it. The revolution was a watershed in French and European history, and even more than 200 years later, the echoes of the voices of Danton or Robespierre have not yet died away.
And the collapse of the ancient regime wasn't sudden. The sources emphasize it was a long-term failure of the monarchy under Louis XVI to respond adequately to the pressures of a changing world. Both external pressures, like global expansion by others, and internal ones, a society transformed by new ideas and economic shifts.
So the old formula didn't work anymore.
Exactly. Quote, "But these were symptoms of a long-term failure of the monarchy to respond adequately, either to external challenges from a world enlarged by imperialism, or to internal challenges from a changing society. And the medieval formula of absolute monarchy by divine right no longer corresponded to the reality of a nation obliged to change in response to a changing world."
It's also important to see this revolution as part of a broader wave, right? Your sources note it converged with other revolutionary movements, influenced by changes sweeping across Europe.
Yes, agricultural, social, intellectual, economic changes.
Yeah.
It wasn't happening in a vacuum.
The early phase saw key figures emerge in the Constituent Assembly. Lafayette, Mirabeau, Danton, Marat, Robespierre.
A mix of people. Initially, many sought a constitutional monarchy. You had those loyal to the king but wanting reform, alongside those pushing for more radical change.
And political energy surged outside the assembly too. Political clubs like the Jacobins.
Absolutely, a surge in activism. And within these clubs, radicals like Robespierre and Danton gained prominence, fiercely competing for influence, pushing the revolution in more extreme directions. There was this growing opposition, the sources say. It was clear that there was now an ominous opposition between the radicals and the moderates, just as there was an opposition between the assembly and the sans-culottes.
The sans-culottes being the working-class revolutionaries.
Correct. Despite the divisions, the assembly achieved major milestones. Drafting a constitution, launching the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen.
A foundational document for human rights globally.
Absolutely. Though your sources correctly point out, women were notably excluded from voting rights initially.
A key omission. So why did the attempt at a constitutional monarchy fail so quickly?
Several factors, according to your sources. Errors regarding the church's role, the king's own lack of commitment, rising internal tensions between moderates and radicals, and crucially, the external threat.
Other European monarchies getting nervous.
Terrified the revolutionary ideas would spread. Quote, "In the end, however, the main reason for the failure to set up a constitutional monarchy was that this revolution in the largest country on the continent was bound to provoke hostility from the other monarchies of Europe."
Which led to the dramatic shift. Fall of the monarchy, establishment of the First Republic, Louis XVI's trial and execution.
Exactly. And then came the darkest period, the Reign of Terror.
Driven by paranoia and the need to stabilize the Republic.
Yes, against internal and external enemies. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by figures like Robespierre, instituted a brutal dictatorship, thousands executed as perceived enemies.
But that intensity couldn't last. Robespierre's own extremism led to his downfall.
And execution. The sources note the tragic irony. And there is a tragic irony about the fate of Robespierre himself. A high Puritan, a deist who attacked atheism, he was driven to reproduce it in mirror image form. His fate starkly illustrated the dangers of revolutionary fervor consuming its own.
So after the terror, moderates established the Directoire, trying for stability.
They tried, but it struggled. Threats from remaining royalists, Jacobin radicals, and plagued by internal corruption.
Which created the perfect environment for Napoleon Bonaparte's rise.
Exactly. Building on his military successes, he seized power in a coup, initially as first consul. He brought a form of stability while continuing foreign conflicts.
And as his first consul, later emperor, he enacted sweeping reforms, the Napoleonic Code.
Yes, reforms that reshaped French law, administration, education, many still influential today. But his relentless military campaigns eventually led to defeats and his abdication.
Napoleon's legacy is complex, still debated.
Very much so. Your sources see him as consolidating many revolutionary changes while establishing a new authoritarian order, initiating a Bonapartist tradition of strong, centralized rule. They even touch on personal details, like Josephine's influence on horticulture and arts, reminding us history includes personal stories, too.
Right, so the 19th century, after Napoleon, it was defined by the constant aftershocks of that great revolution.
Constantly reverberating. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, but the revolution had fundamentally changed France and Europe.
A century marked by rising nationalisms, the transition to industrial society, deep ideological divides, secular republicanism versus royalist Catholicism, and frequent, often violent regime changes. The quote captures it. The problem was to create a new world on the ruins of the old.
And the restored monarchy struggled. Louis VIII ruled a limited monarchy, faced ultra-royalist pressures. His successor, Charles X, pursued much stricter royalist policies.
Provoking opposition, leading to the July Revolution of 1830.
Right, which brought the July monarchy under Louis Philippe, a shift towards the wealthy bourgeois class.
Seen as the king of the French rather than king of France, right? More popular, less divine.
Exactly, but it faced growing discontent from workers, lower classes, strikes, violent uprisings. The phrase often associated with it is "enrichissez vous, get rich," highlighting that focus on bourgeois prosperity.
Then the 1848 revolution, sweeping across Europe, sparked another upheaval in France, the short-lived Second Republic.
Promised democratic reforms, universal male suffrage, but quickly succumbed to internal conflicts. Class struggles erupting in the brutal June Days uprising and repression. Your source is, quote, a figure reflecting the intense class tensions. The agenda for 1849 is revolution by the French working class, world war. Intense times.
Culturally, the 19th century saw shifts too, from romanticism, reflecting the upheaval, towards realism.
Yes, realism aimed to depict everyday life, social issues more accurately. Writers like Victor Hugo, Balzac were deeply engaged in the social and political debates through their novels. The sources mention the shift away from the old, romanticized higher reality that art was supposed to be about, and include that provocative anarchist quote, "Property is theft," highlighting radical social critique.
Then came the Second Empire under Napoleon III, 1852-1870. Significant economic growth, modernization.
Yes, major infrastructure projects like rebuilding Paris under Haussmann. But it was an autocratic regime, facing growing challenges from social inequality, political opposition.
And his downfall was swift. Triggered by foreign policy mistakes, military failures, defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870.
Quote, the law of unintended consequences struck again. His defeat led directly to the empire's collapse and the proclamation of another republic amidst chaos.
Wow.
The powerful insight your sources offer on the 19th century is this persistent pattern. Revolution, reaction, repeat. A century defined by the struggle to reconcile the ideals of '89 with attempts to restore order or centralize power, leading to this cycle of instability and profound transformation that shaped modern France.
Moving into the era of the Third Republic, starting 1870, your sources immediately point to deep political tensions between Paris and the provinces.
A recurring theme, isn't it? Paris, often seen as the heart of Republican ideals, frequently at odds with a more conservative, sometimes royalist countryside.
The sources mentioned the Commune was like an embarrassing family secret for a long time, and that setting up the new assembly at Versailles fueled fears of restoring the monarchy.
Exactly. Quote, this anti-Prussian, anti-government feeling was reinforced by the installation of the newly elected assembly at Versailles, which raised fears of a restoration of the monarchy.
The sources do caution that interpreting Paris simply as a Republican beacon against rural conservatism is likely an oversimplification of a complex reality.
Good point. So the Siege of Paris in 1871, during and after the defeat by Prussia, brutally highlighted this divide.
Horrendous conditions for Parisians, feeling abandoned by the new national government at Versailles, and the ultimate humiliation, the German Empire proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles.
The Paris Commune emerged from this intense frustration.
Your sources call it largely a spontaneous reaction. Quote, "The Commune was largely a spontaneous reaction to these highly exceptional circumstances. Reaction to the siege, the defeat, the harsh surrender terms. A coalition of radicals, workers advocating social justice, self-governance for Paris, met with brutal force by the Versailles government."
The suppression was swift and violent, the Semaine Sanglante, Bloody Week. The Versailles government's crackdown resulted in thousands of deaths, left deep scars of betrayal, resentment, especially among working classes. Quote, Semaine Sanglante, or Bloody Week, was a dramatic episode where Republican forces ended the Commune with a violent crackdown.
Its legacy was complex, long suppressed.
Yes, overshadowed by the violence. Differing interpretations, precursor to socialism, or maybe the tragic final act of the Jacobin revolutionary tradition. Quote, "The Commune was less the harbinger of the Russian Revolution than the last of the series of revolutions opened up in 1789, the last throw of the Jacobin tradition."
But despite this violent birth, the Third Republic was established.
It was. Though initially dominated by royalists, Republicans gradually gained control. They enacted significant secular and social reforms, laying much of the groundwork for modern French institutions. Universal male suffrage strengthened the state's political authority, too. Quote, "The physical power of the state had been greatly increased by economic modernization and its political authority strengthened by universal male suffrage."
The late 19th century also saw an explosion of cultural creativity. Impressionist painters.
Yes, challenging traditional artistic norms, enriching the art world significantly.
But the period leading up to World War I is described as the twilight of the Belle Époque.
The beautiful era, yes, often remembered nostalgically, as the quote says. It was only in retrospect, after the catastrophe, that the years leading up to the First World War came to be seen nostalgically as the good times, la Belle Époque. But France faced underlying issues: demographic challenges, rising nationalistic pressures, a fragile situation before the catastrophe.
And the demographic cost of WWI for France was huge.
Immense, especially as the country already faced disadvantages. Quote, "Yet this takes no account of the French war injured, of the inevitable fall in the birth rate of a country already at a demographic disadvantage. France had needed to call up more men per thousand and had proportionately lost more."
World War I began with nationalist fervor, unexpected alliances, then devolved into horrifying trench warfare.
The human cost was staggering.
Yeah.
Deep psychological, physical scars, forever altering France's social fabric. Quote, "We civilizations now know that we are mortal," a profound realization.
And it forced a reevaluation of fundamental ideas.
Yes. Quote, "We have entered an era wherein humanity must grapple with its moral and ethical frameworks in the face of scientific advancement and historical calamity."
The aftermath left France grappling with profound loss, trauma, intensifying internal conflicts.
A nation forced to confront its changed reality.
So the period 1919-1940 is framed in your sources as defeat out of victory, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in that symbolic Hall of Mirrors.
Right, where the German Empire was proclaimed in 1871, meant to secure peace, but it excluded and humiliated Germany, creating deep resentment.
The peace negotiations among the Big Four, Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, revealed starkly different goals.
Very different. Wilson's idealism, League of Nations, self-determination versus Clemenceau's pragmatism, wanting punitive reparations, security for France. Lloyd George often mediating. The sources quote, "The sentiment that peace relied entirely on Allied unity. The sole guarantee for the maintenance of peace was the maintenance of solidarity by the victors."
But the treaty faced significant criticism.
Yes. Figures like Keynes, Bainville criticized Clemenceau's harsh reparations, arguing they prioritized punishment over long-term stability. This lack of a coherent vision contributed to a precarious peace.
Culturally, the post-WWI landscape saw movements like surrealism emerge.
Reflecting widespread disillusionment with the rationalism blamed for the war, challenging traditional notions of identity, reality.
Amidst economic difficulties and political polarization, the Popular Front government under Léon Blum in 1936 brought a brief period of hope.
A fleeting moment. Significant social reforms, workers' rights, paid vacations, social benefits. Created a new sense of dignity for many. Quote, "The French left in particular, it was a momentary glimpse of a better future and a blueprint for the new republic that would come into being after the Second World War."
But the growing threats from fascism and communism intensified divisions.
Sharply, both domestically and internationally. Anti-republican groups gained strength. Fractures on the left hindered unified response. These internal weaknesses, economic hardship, a fearful populace, left France ill-prepared for WWII.
And it's in this context that de Gaulle's 1940 call to arms from London stands out.
A powerful symbol of resistance against despair, foreshadowing his crucial future role.
World War II brought the harsh reality of German occupation. Your sources touch on complex experiences of freedom and constraint, mentioning Sartre's famous, maybe controversial declaration.
Yes. Never were we freer than when under the German occupation, wrote Jean-Paul Sartre famously. The sources note that while this highlights existential choices under extreme pressure, critics like Julian Jackson argue it can seem detached from the brutal realities loss, fear, survival faced by ordinary people. Points to that complex psychological space, potential cognitive dissonance between survival and resistance ideals.
The initial reaction to the rapid German conquest involved adapting to drastically changed daily life. Troops, shortages, curfews, arrests.
Yes. And the French state, under Marshal Pétain, adopted a strategy of passive cooperation with occupiers, quickly diverging from the British approach.
Leading to Vichy France, the collaborationist regime.
In the unoccupied zone after the armistice, Pétain presented as a paternalistic symbol, Laval as the pragmatic politician running things. Pétain aimed for a national revolution, replacing Republican values with traditional ones.
And Vichy implemented oppressive measures against Jews, marginalized groups.
Quickly, quote, Pétain, as Laval jokingly told him, acquired more powers than Louis XIV, and he offered himself as the old soldier, the national icon sacrificing himself for his country. Plus, that message would be hammered home by a state propaganda effort to rival the glorification of Louis XIV.
Meanwhile, General de Gaulle, isolated in London,
worked tirelessly, building the Free French forces, coordinating growing resistance networks inside France. His vision directly opposed Vichy, restoring a free French republic.
But he struggled for Allied acceptance initially, seen as unconventional.
Yes, lacking resources, sometimes dismissed as a cardboard general.
But as the war turned, resistance networks grew stronger.
Gained momentum, organization, diverse, sometimes fragmented, but crucial. De Gaulle faced the challenge of unifying them, but his leadership was bolstered by free French successes and increasing Allied recognition.
Vichy's downfall was tied directly to the Allied advance.
Yes. As Allies moved across France, Pétain and Laval were sidelined. The contributions of internal resistance, free French forces, culminated in de Gaulle's symbolic and politically crucial role in liberating Paris in August 1944. Solidified his standing. Quote, "It was a magnificent bluff which transformed the resistance, real as it was, into a controlling national myth."
The period after liberation involved a difficult reckoning. Trials of collaborators?
Yes, trials, executions occurred. But the sources note many Vichy figures faced little punishment for decades, part of a collective reluctance to fully confront the complexities, compromises of the war years.
The narrative of a unified French resistance became a potent national myth.
Very potent, often overshadowing the uncomfortable realities of collaboration, deep divisions. De Gaulle shaped this image, but the sources suggest a long-term collective denial about the full complexity persisted.
So looking back at the war through your sources, de Gaulle's leadership was crucial in transforming defeated France into a recognized victorious ally.
Absolutely. Yet the legacy of Vichy, the occupation trauma, continue to fuel discussion, reflection, a history France has grappled with, coming to terms with.
So following the war, we entered the era of the Fourth Republic, starting January 1947. Quickly gained a poor reputation for instability.
Yes, instability is the key word. A major reason was the proportional voting system. Led to a highly fragmented political landscape, rapid turnover of governments.
How many governments?
The sources mention a staggering 26 governments between 1947 and 1958. This inability to form stable coalitions was critical in its failure to manage the growing Algerian crisis, leading directly to the Fifth Republic. Public cynicism grew. Quote, "The great irony of the Fourth Republic is that the governmental instability barely mattered in regard to the reconstruction, nor did it prevent the emergence of a quite visionary foreign policy." Strange paradox.
The challenges facing France after the war were immense. Destruction, casualties, economic setbacks, rationing.
And weakened at home, France faced mounting independence movements across its colonial empire.
The political landscape was also altered by rising communist influence.
Yes. Immediately post-war, with the traditional right discredited by Vichy, the Communist Party made substantial gains in the 45 elections, reflecting popular support and the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe.
Political instability was compounded by the Cold War?
Absolutely. De Gaulle's resignation in 46, after failing to get support for a stronger executive, was an early sign. The Cold War, intensifying from April 47 polarized French politics further. Communist ministers dismissed from government, hardening lines between Gaullists and leftist coalitions. Your sources quote that sentiment about Algeria. Yet for French politicians, the loss of Algeria was as unthinkable as the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Shows the mindset.
Culturally, socially, it was dynamic, though. Existentialism?
Very dynamic. Inspired writers, artists, musicians. Existentialist thought Sartre exploring freedom, responsibility, intense debates about Marxism. Your sources note, Sartre's approach is in some ways a curious one.
Economically, Jean Monnet played a critical role.
Instrumental. Setting up post-war planning, reconstruction frameworks. Aided significantly by the Marshall Plan, focused on reopening markets, prioritizing key industries, leading to substantial recovery.
France was also a driving force behind early European integration. Schuman Plan.
Yes, spearheaded by figures like Monet and Robert Schuman. The 1950 Schuman Plan, common market for coal and steel between France and West Germany, was pivotal for reconciliation integration. Monet also advocated for a European defense community.
But colonial tensions escalated dramatically, especially Algeria.
The war for independence there became incredibly divisive. Successive governments struggled. The military response, including controversial tactics like torture, alienated segments of the French populace and international opinion. Quote, "Withdrawal is unacceptable for France, which would become a diminished second- or third-rate power deprived of its world role." That fear of diminishment again.
Ultimately, the instability of the Fourth Republic, exacerbated by the Algerian crisis, required de Gaulle's return.
A moment that would fundamentally reshape the French political landscape.
This whole post-war era, particularly the Fourth Republic, really highlights France grappling with fundamental questions. Identity, its place in the New World, the tension between parliamentary democracy and the need for strong leadership, all against the backdrop of decolonization and the Cold War. And that brings us to de Gaulle's return in 1958 and the birth of the Fifth Republic. Your sources note his enduring legacy, comparing him to Louis XIV, Napoleon.
As someone who profoundly shaped the nation, yes. Described as complex conservatism mixed with republicanism fiercely prioritizing France's national interests. Quote, "The state needs a head, a leader, directing its destiny. And the French need to be proud of France. If France ceases to be a great power, it is nothing. Plus, it can certainly be said that de Gaulle tried hard to make the rhetoric of grandeur come true."
His return in '58 during the Algerian crisis was a moment of crisis in action.
Brought back with a mandate to reform the state. The new constitution he oversaw was designed specifically to fix the Fourth Republic's weaknesses by consolidating executive power in the presidency. Elevating the presidency above fragmented party politics, he rallied public support for this.
He then navigated the treacherous Algerian crisis.
Deeply divisive issue. But he ultimately steered France towards recognizing Algerian independence. Controversial, but decisive.
Your sources highlight significant transformations during his presidency. Demographic growth.
Robust growth, rising life expectancy, declining infant mortality, increasing immigration. Quote, "This rapid economic change naturally affected lifestyles. The main effect was the explosion of the new baby boom generation. Economically, France experienced the peak of the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of post-war prosperity. State planning directed substantial development."
And foreign policy, restoring France's stature.
Absolutely. Prioritized an independent nuclear deterrent from the U.S., critiqued NATO structures, sought relationships beyond traditional Western alliances, advocated for a Europe of nation-states, not a federal Europe.
But his top-down approach faced challenges. Cultural shifts, generational conflict. May '68.
Yes. The youth of the 60s grew dissatisfied with traditional structures, culminating in the widespread protests and general strike of May 1968. Government cultural policies struggled to connect with demands for individuality, new music, new ideas. Quote, "However, leftists in the 1960s were more drawn to the various mutations and repackagings of Marxism."
The significance of May '68 can't be overstated.
Exposed deep divides, dissatisfaction, highlighted weaknesses in de Gaulle's authority. While he survived politically, it forced reevaluation, revealed societal resilience.
Ultimately, his political capital diminished, leading to his '69 referendum defeat and resignation.
Yes, a combination of his struggle to adapt his leadership and the Fifth Republic structure to a rapidly evolving society.
The period after, Pompidou through Chirac, saw the mutations of the Republican monarchy, as your sources put it.
De Gaulle left a challenging legacy, a powerful constitution. Created somewhat hastily its centralized power in the presidency, raising concerns about undermining parliament democratic balance. Quote, The indivisible authority of the state is entirely the responsibility of the president.
Political dynamics post-de Gaulle involved constant reevaluation of presidential powers. The PM's role, cohabitation.
Exactly. Amidst globalization, economic shifts. The structure created situations where an unpopular president might face a hostile parliament, be forced to appoint an opposing PM cohabitation. Quote, "You only have to look at how the French behave to recognize their profound natural inability to let themselves be governed." A bit cynical, perhaps.
Pompidou's presidency, 1969-1974, aimed to modernize, liberalize, while continuing Gaullist policies.
Yes. Eased media control, labor reforms, more conciliatory regionally, embraced some cultural innovations. Faced challenges from the 73 oil crisis, though.
Giscard d'Estaing, 1974-1981, represented a move away from Gaullism.
Yes. Domestic reforms for a more liberal society, decentralization, breaking state media monopoly. More informal style. But struggled for parliamentary support amidst economic challenges, leading to his unexpected 81 defeat.
Then François Mitterrand's election in 81. A major shift. Socialist government.
Change la vie. Change life was the slogan. Significant social reforms. Abolish death penalty. Civil unions for same-sex couples, 35-hour week. Major cultural project.
But faced economic challenges. Unemployment.
Persistently. Eventually shifted to a more pragmatic, market-oriented approach after difficulties implementing ambitious socialism in one-country policies.
The Mitterrand era also saw the first periods of cohabitation, with Chirac as PM.
Yes. This unique French setup highlighted inherent tensions in the Fifth Republic's constitution. The political landscape continued to fragment, though Mitterrand won re-election in 88. Quote, "The system promotes fragmentation and public cynicism."
Economic challenges, unemployment continued through Jacques Chirac's presidency, 1995-2007, criticism for policies, political scandals.
Yes. Persistent difficulties. Criticism for economic policies, scandals plagued his time, contributing to public disillusionment. The sources cite a, quote, "critical of unchecked power." This way of exercising power and to the absence of adequate institutional, political, social, and above all, moral checks and balances. Constitutional changes, electoral laws tried to address concerns, but questions about French governance remained. The sources also list the Clearstream scandal, though without details.
Okay.
Your sources conclude this section by noting that while the Fifth Republic emerged from crises and has shown resilience, the balance of power, effectiveness of institutions continue to be scrutinized as France faces ongoing challenges in a modern, interconnected world.
It's fascinating. That tension within the Fifth Republic, the strong presidency designed by de Gaulle, facing the realities of party politics, cohabitation, globalization. How does this unique structure shape French governance today?
Which brings us to a central theme your sources discuss. The idea of the French exception. Reality or illusion today?
A big question. Your sources immediately point to the deep, enduring regional diversity within France. Brittany, Alsace, Provence. Distinct identities. Quote, "Its diversity is manifest, enduring, and structural." They cite historian Fernand Braudel, emphasizing this lasting diversity against any simple narrative of a single French spirit.
And the concept of the French exception itself suggests France is unique culturally, politically, its global role. But, the sources note, discussions often focus on whether this exceptionalism is ending. Quote, "France is not like other countries. It has special responsibilities, inherited from its history and universal values." They mention historian François Furet arguing in 88 that France no longer holds a special geopolitical position, should engage as a regular medium-sized nation.
Historically, France has certainly aspired to be an exemplary society, a model, reflecting past power.
The sources connect this aspiration to the absolute state under Louis XIV, the Enlightenment's universalist ideas, the Revolution's drive to spread ideals like liberty, equality. This internal conflict between different universalist visions has deeply shaped French politics.
A core component of this perceived exception is the French conception of the state. Indivisible, secular, democratic, social.
Quote, "France is a republic which is indivisible, secular, democratic, and social. The approach to citizenship emphasizes equality under law over recognizing group identities, promoting integration over multiculturalism.
And the strong commitment to secularism, laïcité.
Aim is for a neutral public space, but often leads to intense controversies, especially over religious symbols. The sources also highlight solidarity. Quote, "Solidarity is the cement which holds society together."
Your sources also discuss the French social model. Chirac described it as a collective aspiration for high societal standards.
A hybrid system, combining European welfare models with state planning, dirigism, extensive welfare services. Quote, the aspiration to create the exemplary society is embodied in the planned coordination of economic dirigism, state education, and social welfare. But they also note complexities, multiple subsystems, uneven access, persistent reforms needed.
The educational system is another distinct area. Grande école versus public universities.
Yes. That division shapes who rises to power, raising questions about meritocracy, access for the less privileged.
So today, the sources suggest the French exception feels more like an aspiration than an undeniable reality.
Facing significant challenges, globalization impacting state control, university reforms, economic sustainability of the social model, competitive international landscape, domestic pressures, determining its future viability.
Is the idea of the French exception a strength, driving France to uphold universal ideals? Or a challenge, making it harder to adapt pragmatically to a globalized world?
That tension clearly plays out in many contemporary French debates. It's a core question.
Bringing us to more recent times, your sources touch on concerns during Chirac's second term, early 2000s, a sense of morosité.
A term so widely used, it felt almost clinical, as the quote says. The population was said to be suffering from morosité, a term so widely used as to acquire an almost clinical quality, reflecting a sense of national decline.
Fueled by rising crime, persistent unemployment, government infighting Sarkozy versus Villepin?
Yes. Quote about Sarkozy. For Sarkozy had only recently been a minister at both finance and the interior and had not been a conspicuous success at either. Adds context. There was also an assassination attempt on Chirac, international tensions like the Iraq War lead-up, adding to the unease. Quote about potential rivals. However, it might be a different matter if the former socialist minister Dominique Strauss-Kahn were to stand.
The government under Raffarin, then with Sarkozy in key roles, tried to tackle crime, unemployment.
With initiatives like budget cuts, privatizations, health reforms, but often faced significant public resistance.
Yep.
Ultimately failed to generate widespread success, contributing to disastrous 2004 electoral results.
On the international stage, France under Chirac maintained a distinct foreign policy, opposing the U.S.-led Iraq invasion in 2003.
Yes. Consistent with France's desire for multilateralism, independent foreign policy legacy from figures like de Gaulle strained U.S. relations significantly. Your sources suggest this stance was also influenced by a legacy of imperial interest, protecting historical ties against perceived neoconservative pressures.
Domestic political turmoil escalated with protests from minority communities, culminating in widespread riots in 2005.
Yes. Starkly highlighted deeper societal issues: immigration, integration, discrimination. Inflammatory remarks by figures like Sarkozy seemed to escalate tensions. Government reforms, like Villepin's employment initiatives, backfired. Quote, they were, in effect, asking whether the Republican claim to equality and solidarity could be real if it did not apply to them. And Chirac recognized when he spoke of an identity crisis and of the need to abolish discrimination. Your sources also list the Clearstream scandal during this period, though without details.
Okay.
Overall, this more recent period outlined in your sources was marked by significant domestic anxieties, intense political maneuvering, and France asserting a distinct foreign policy stance that sometimes put it at odds with the prevailing global order, highlighting internal social frictions and debates about national identity.
Wow, what an incredible sweep of history we've covered in this deep dive through your sources. From those mysterious ancient cave painters and the ingenuity of the Gauls.
Right through the rise and fall of monarchies.
The seismic shifts of revolutions, the trials of world wars, occupation, the complexities of the Fifth Republic, right up to the political and social challenges of recent years. It's been fascinating to unpack these layers with you.
It truly has. And what consistently emerges from your material are these powerful recurring themes, aren't they? That ongoing tension between centralization and regional identity, the deep ideological struggles that repeatedly reshape the nation, the persistent quest for a unique French identity and its place in the world, and that undeniable, enduring legacy of its revolutionary past, always sort of bubbling beneath the surface.
So given this deep dive into France's history, revolutions, radical shifts in power, the ongoing debate over its identity, the French exception, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. How might these deep historical currents continue to shape its response to the major challenges of the 21st century?
Things like globalization, social integration, economic sustainability.
Exactly. And maintaining its influence on the international stage. What might the next chapter in this incredibly complex story look like, viewed through the lens of these centuries of history?
It's certainly a history that suggests the future will be anything but predictable.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into your sources on French history.